But now we're going to continue, or I should say, now we're going to conclude our series of sermons looking at the early stories of Genesis. They have been some interesting stories, no doubt. We've looked at 2 creation stories. We've looked at Cain and Abel, and we've also looked at Noah and the flood. And so today we're going to finish with the Tower of Babel. Now, just to review 2 main ideas that undergird this series of sermons here. Number 1 is the belief that many people have that the Bible, at least the first 5 books of the Bible, probably even more than that, were compiled together in their current form while the Jewish people were living in exile. They were living in Babylon. Babylon is they are the people that came and destroyed their kingdom. They destroyed their temple, the city of Jerusalem, everything. And those that were not killed were forced to live in Babylon, the land of their captors, the land of their destroyers. And so they weren't too favorable towards the Babylonian people at that time. And they were also trying to make sense of it. How could this happen? Why would this happen? Why would God have this happen? Because everything was thought to be the direct cause of God back then. And so they put their stories together in a grand narrative, a grand history that had a reason, and that was to tell why God allowed this exile to happen. So that's the first thought. The second thought is that there are more than one kind of truth. So there's historical, factual truth, and some stories, both in the Bible and in general, some stories are primarily concerned with reporting the facts, reporting what happened, history. Some stories are based on history, but that might not be their main concern. They might be mostly concerned with sharing some deeper truth about humanity or God. And then some stories have no concern with history at all, and they are just mainly concerned with teaching some idea or lesson about life. And so we have all kinds of these stories in the Bible and in life in general. So as we get in the story of the Tower of Babel, this story is the shortest of all of them that we've looked at. I'm pretty sure it's shorter even than Cain and Abel. But it's a really interesting story. It seems simple on the surface, but it has a lot of depth to it. And so in the story, all the people of the world are still gathered in one place. This takes place right after the story of Noah and the flood in the order of things in the Bible. And so there are not a lot of people, and they're all in one place, but they're migrating, they're moving, they're searching for something. They are a nomadic group, but they decide that when they get to this place called Shinar, this Shinar is a Mesopotamian river valley that is located where Babylon is located in the time of the exile. And so this story is placed in the location where Babylon would be for the Jewish people reading it. And so the people in the story decide they're going to settle here, and they're going to build a city and a tower. So usually we just think of the tower, but they're building a city and a tower. And this tower is massive, of course, as we know from the story. The top reaches up towards the heavens. And so we remember that back then people believed that the abode of the gods, the place where the gods resided, were the heavens, which meant sky. It wasn't another dimension, but it was literally up in the sky. It was believed that that's where the gods lived. And mountains back then were the tallest structures on earth. And so it was believed that the gods would come down oftentimes on mountaintops. And so we have Moses going up Mount Sinai to encounter God and receive the commandments. And so sometimes people would also build tall structures that kind of look like the picture on the screen. It's kind of steps, step-like structure going up. And sometimes people would build towers that would kind of act like a man-made mountain. And then oftentimes people would build some kind of a temple or an altar on top of the building, and it was thought that the gods could come down there and have a place to stay. So in this story, in this case, the people are building a tower that reaches up towards the heavens, not necessarily so that a god can come down, but so that they can go up. And so God comes down to see what's going on. This reminds us that, again, that the earlier we go in the Bible, and all of these stories in this series are early, the earlier we go, the more human-like God is thought to be. And so people's ideas and how they thought about God would change and adapt throughout the Bible. So you'll see less of this type of thing later on in the Bible, but especially in the early stories of Genesis, you see God portrayed as not being all-knowing, that he doesn't necessarily know everything. So he has to go down and see what's going on. And, he's going to check out and see what it is that the humans have been up to. And so he goes down and he sees this city and this tower that they have built, and immediately God is stressed. He's worried and he's beside himself because he sees what all they have accomplished, and he thinks if they have been able to do all of this together, nothing will be impossible for them. This is a very similar theme to what we see in the story of Adam and Eve, where they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then God is worried that if they stay in the garden, they're going to eat from the tree of life, and then they're going to gain immortality, and they're going to become divine. So they're going to become just like him, and then what would happen? And so to prevent that, he kicks them out of the garden. Same thing here in this story. We see God worried that if the people continue to work together, that they are going to possibly become divine themselves and may even overtake him. I know that's a strange idea. And that's not usually how we think of it when we read the story, but there it is. God seems very concerned that evidently, according to this story, there's a very real threat here, that humanity could become divine and could overtake him. And so to prevent that, God scatters the people. He scatters them all around the known world, gives them different languages so they can't understand each other. Because if they can't understand each other, they cannot join together and work together and cause a threat to God. And so that's it. That's the story. It's kind of a neat story about how people came to have different languages. It presents kind of like the story of Adam and Eve was meant to tell us why certain things are the way they are. So this one is meant to tell us why there are different languages. Now, a couple of things about this story. First of all, in Genesis 10, so this story is in Genesis 11. In Genesis 10, it tells a different story about how the people were scattered about the earth. Now, Genesis 10, it talks about the descendants of Noah. And even though it has to do with Noah, I didn't talk about it in last week's sermon on Noah because, well, very few people care about chapter 10. If you read through it, you'll know what I mean. It's one of those chapters that if you're trying to read through the Bible, you probably might skim it. It's just talking about the descendants of Noah's sons and what they do and how they end up becoming all of the known nations of the world at that time. And so it's not very interesting to us. And it really didn't have much to do with the Noah story for our purposes last week, but for now, in talking about the Tower of Babel, it is interesting because in Genesis 10, it seems to tell a different story. It says that basically, it's not as exciting as the Tower of Babel, but it says that basically the people, the descendants of Noah's sons, naturally throughout time, spread out over the earth and created different cultures, nations, and ways of doing things. And so that gave a very, kind of a more of a natural way of the scattering of the people compared to Genesis 11, which has a very big supernatural confrontation. And this just reminds us that many of the stories in the Bible existed before they were put together with one another. And some stories are meant to go with one another more readily than others. So, for instance, the stories talking about the different kings of Israel, those are much more cohesive and meant more to go together. But especially in the early stories of Genesis, it's almost kind of like a book of short stories. It's a collection of stories that may or may not be in chronological order. They may or may not be meant to fit perfectly together with every other story in that collection. And sometimes they tell alternate versions of how things came to be. This is not something that we just discovered today because we're so much smarter than the people back then. This is something that they would have even known and recognized themselves, and it didn't concern them. It wasn't a problem because, again, their point was not to tell a literal, chronological history of everything that happened, but they had a very specific purpose, and that is to tell why they were in exile and also to tell their story as a Jewish people. So that's one thing to think about, that Genesis 10 and 11 tell different ways that the world was scattered. Also, of course, they would not have had a concept of continents separated by oceans. Secondly, there are many people who believe that this story of the Tower of Babel might be a form of political propaganda. So hear me out here. Political propaganda, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, where does this story take place? Babylon. It takes place in Babylon. It is presented as being a story of how Babylon got its start. And so the people build a city. And of course, it's kind of as political propaganda, it would be slightly humorous, kind of a mocking tone to it, making a mockery out of the Babylonian culture. The Babylonian culture was very well advanced for those days. They were very smart. They had a lot of things that they had come up with, including a way to build tall structures. And so you can read in this story, if you go by this train of thought, thinking that this could be political propaganda, you can see how they are mocking Babylonian culture, saying, oh, you guys think you're so wonderful, you think you're so high and mighty, and you can accomplish anything you want to. Well, God is going to humble you. And we see this in Isaiah, in the prophet Isaiah. He describes, I believe it's in chapter 14, Isaiah describes the Babylonian king. And he says, of the Babylonian king, he says that you have made yourself so high and mighty, even placing yourself upon the throne of God, raising yourself up to the clouds of the heavens. And so we see a lot of similarities to this tower, which is said to reach up to the clouds of the heavens. And so we also see at the end that what is this city named? Of course, it's not named Babylon, right? Because this is, kind of like political cartoons don't necessarily spell out exactly what's going on, but you know what it is because you're living in the context. They call it Babel, which means confusion. But it also means Babylon. I mean, Babylon, and it's in the same location where Babylon is located. I mean, in some ways it doesn't get any more clear than that. And they're kind of making fun of the name Babylon and saying, oh, Babel, confusion. They're just nonsensical. And we still use that word today to refer to somebody who's speaking nonsense. We say they're babbling, right? And that comes from that. And so many people believe that this could be political propaganda, making a mockery of Babylon. You see, the Jewish people believed that the reason why they ended up in exile was because they sinned. And so God, they believed, was using Babylon as an instrument of his wrath to kill them and place the survivors in a foreign land. But they also believed that in due time, God would then punish Babylon for what they had done and for being so full of themselves and not being humble. Now, if that idea is strange to you, the idea that God would use a group of people to punish another group of people and then punish them for doing what God just used them for doing, don't stress yourself out. You don't have to necessarily agree with the same thinking that they thought. Again, this was a day and a time when they believed that everything that happened in the world, including every political reality, had to have a direct cause by God. And back then it was even more difficult for them to do this because they didn't have a Satan figure to pin it on. So everything was because of God. And so, they kind of try to make sense of this in the best way that they can. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to think that God works that way, but that's the way they thought about the political realities of their day. So, could be that this story is political propaganda. We don't know for sure, but there are clues in there that lead people to believe that this might be the case. Again, realizing that these stories are geared towards the people living in exile in Babylon. So, whatever the case may be for that, what does this story have to teach us? Well, certainly not that cities or towers are inherently bad, right? We have many cities in the world, and we have many, many towers in the world, and the towers that we make today are much taller than any towers that they could have made back then, and we know that we are not going to reach a God, no matter how tall our towers may be. But, so that's not teaching us against the building of cities or towers. This is also certainly not teaching us that we shouldn't seek diversity, or that we shouldn't work together across cultural and language barriers in order to accomplish great things, right? In fact, today, this weekend being Pentecost Sunday, we remember that when the disciples were gathered in that upper room during the Jewish festival of Pentecost, all the different peoples of the area of that time were gathered together in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's population swelled during that time with all kinds of people who spoke many different languages. And when the Holy Spirit comes upon the disciples, they go out and they share their first public speaking ever since Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And so Peter and the others, they speak, and everybody can hear them in their own language. It's kind of like a reversal of the Tower of Babel, if you want to think about it that way, that God is saying, I want everyone to be able to understand this. And so this story certainly is not prohibition against working together with different kinds of people to accomplish great things. But what this story is it is a warning to us, just as many believe it was a warning to Babylon. It is a warning to us, to any empire in the world, to avoid the temptation to become so full of themselves that they believe that nothing can happen to them, that they believe that they are better than everyone else. You see, empires throughout history are susceptible towards certain temptations, especially the more powerful they are. There's nothing wrong with pride. Pride is not inherently bad or evil. Pride can be healthy, a certain amount of it. But pride, especially when it is combined with power, can be a lethal combination, because it can lead us or empires to believe that they are better than anyone else. And in a conquest for more and more power and might, an empire can forget to care for the poor or the outsiders or the disenfranchised. In its quest for power, it can be easy or tempting to believe that the way of life of the empire is the way that everybody should live their lives, and that the empire can make the world a better place if everybody would just live like they do. And many times throughout history, we know that empires have forced other people to live as they do, thinking that they're making the world a better place while they're actually making it worse. Babylon did this. Assyria did this, both in the Old Testament. Rome did this in the New Testament. Empires throughout history are tempted by this. And yet, this story is telling us that we got to be careful. We have to remain humble. We have to remember to continue to follow the ethic of Jesus in loving others, including our enemies, being ready to forgive, turning the other cheek, and forgive. Well, I think I already mentioned forgiveness. But, you know, the ethic of Jesus is really hard for empires to live out. It goes against many of the values of the empires of the world, but it's what we're called to do. But it's hard. But the thing is, it's not only hard for empires, it's also hard for individuals. Same thing for us. If we are prideful and we have power, possibly power over others, then it can be tempting to use what we have and to believe that we are better than other people. Maybe because of the choices we made, maybe because of the situation that we're in life, but we tend to think, oh, we're better than certain other kinds of people. And sometimes we can tend to believe that our way of life is the best way of life, and if others would just act like me, the world would be so much better. You know, it's so tempting to think that. Who of us hasn't thought that at one time or another, right? But that's probably just human. But when we act on that and or try to force other people to do that, that's when we combine pride and power and we fall prey to the kinds of things that they warn against in the Tower of Babel story. It's saying that, there's not necessarily anything wrong with pride. There's not necessarily anything wrong with power, because we can accomplish good things. But we have to remain humble, individually or as a group. We have to remain humble. We have to not consider ourselves better than other people who may think differently, as hard as that is. But it says in Philippians, do not think of others as, well, I think I said that word wrong. Do not think of yourself as better than others, but consider others as better than yourselves, in my own words. But the idea is that we continue to live according to that ethic of Jesus, to reach out, to include others, to care for the poor, the outcast, the disenfranchised, and to do what we can to spread the love of Jesus. Because if there is any way that all of us should live, it is according to the way that Jesus taught. And when we do that, when we seek to live according to the way that Jesus taught, then we will build a strong foundation upon which we can build a structure that will be meant to last forever. Amen.